right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining the Virtual Institute on Trauma Research and what it means for our work with victims of crime. You know, the more we understand about trauma, about the nature and the impact of trauma, the better we can craft our response to victims of crime and abuse. This is why I am so pleased to welcome today's presenters, Dr. Dean Kilpatrick and Dr. Connie Best. They and their colleagues at the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center have been leaders in bringing research to those of us in the field of practice. Before we get underway, please do, if you're watching this live, remember to use the chat box for any questions you have for the presenters. And if you're watching the recording of this session, please ask your questions in the discussion forum. Go ahead and try out that chat box or discussion forum now and let us know if you are watching this session with any others, if there's more than one person watching from your computer. Now, before I turn the floor or the screen over to today's presenters, I do want to let you know that the Virtual Institute and today's session are supported with funding for the Office for Victims of Crime at the Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters, and I'll sit back and listen with all of you. Dean, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for us to be here today. And I wanted to explain that one reason that we're not on video is that I had a little run-in with a dermatologist and am just fine, but am bandaged up. And so I was afraid that I might scare some of the participants. And so this is going to be the radio version with our slides showing. What we're going to do today is to give you a little bit about our background and perspective. We're going to talk some about difficult victims, and those of you, we understand it's a broad audience that includes some researchers, but also a lot of victim service professionals and victim advocates and others who deal with crime victims. And their difficult victim is a technical term that we use, and we'll define that a little later. But we'll also define why they are hard to believe sometimes and easy to blame for what happened. We're also going to talk about a very famous study in the field that you've probably heard a lot about called the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And we're going to also talk about some crime-related potentially traumatic events, which are one thing that accounts for a good bit of post-traumatic stress disorder. As I just mentioned, we will be talking about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study as well as the National Survey of Adolescents. We're going to talk about what we've learned from research about how ACEs, as they're called, and PTEs, or potentially traumatic events, increase the risk of physical and behavioral health problems as well as criminal victimization. We will also then be talking about how this is relevant for understanding the ways that victims behave, also how it's useful in reducing victim blame, and how understanding of these procedures can improve investigation, prosecution, and victim assistance. And now what I'm going to do is to turn it over to my colleague, Connie Best, who's going to give you a little bit about our background and perspective.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join you. I wanted to let you know that what our background is, where we're coming from, and what we've done over the years to give a bit of perspective. But Dean and I are both mental health professionals. We are clinical psychologists. We're faculty members at Medical University of South Carolina in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. But we specialize specifically in the assessment and treatment of crime-related, trauma-related mental health issues for crime victims. Even though we're part of the Department of Psychiatry, that is the only thing that we do, that specific area, and it's been our area of specialization for a lot of years. We also, in addition to looking at more of the clinical aspects of that, we're clinical researchers, so one of the things that is very important to us is to study and to know about the exposure of violent crime and the extent to which it increases risk for PTSD and other mental health problems. We also are interested in treatments that are effective, so it's really broad-based, but it's always focused on crime victims. Dean had put this bullet in. It said we have a combined 90 years of experience. I'm not going to explain to you how much of that 90% is his years or mine, but it's just a combination of that. But we've been together for a very long time, and our center's been up and running for about 40 years. So we are not new to this field, but we are still, even at this day, feel it an honor to serve and to work with people who are victim assistance professionals and people who study that, other researchers. So we are very pleased to be with you here today. As Dean mentioned a minute ago, we want to start out by saying what makes victims difficult. Obviously, we don't think they're difficult, but that's how they get labeled. People find them hard to believe, and they are very easy to blame. One of the things that happens is oftentimes crime victims, and many of you have been in the field for a long time and you know exactly what we're referring to, they tell their story in a very confused or disorganized manner. And when people do that, the person that's listening to that, whether it be a law enforcement personnel, another mental health provider, the general public, even their family members and friends, when a story is in a very disorganized way, people think, well, maybe they're not really sort of telling the whole truth, or maybe they're trying to make themselves look good. So that often makes them easy to blame. The way we look at it is if somebody is traumatized and they're stressed, and perhaps if they're a rape victim and they're getting an exam done in the middle of the night, they've been up for all night, they're sleep deprived, all those things feed into a way that somebody may appear confused or disorganized, but it doesn't mean they aren't telling the truth. Their behaviors and emotions often differ from how people think are real victims. I cannot tell you the number of times over the years when people have said, well, that's not what real victims look like. And I thought, you are so mistaken if you think there is one way that all victims look like. But that really feeds into that concept. The third bullet that's up there, we see more and more intoxication at the time of the crime or a history of substance use problems. There are certain populations that's really problematic for, and that's often a college-age sample, excuse me, who, I don't know how the colleges are in your towns and your states, but oftentimes there's high use of alcohol in the college setting, and if they happen to be a victim of any kind of crime while they're intoxicated, then people often blame them, like, you know, this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't have been so drunk and under the influence. And so they're very hard to understand that sometimes people don't know what happened because they were intoxicated at the time. So a lot of these things kind of have a lot of interplay, but they all sort of go towards the end game of people saying the victim is to blame for this. It's his or her fault.
There are some other things that also characterize or are related to victims that we call difficult. If a victim was engaging in risky or dangerous behavior at the time of the crime, many times we tend to blame victims and question their judgment. It's an interesting thing because, I mean, we think there's some psychological reasons people do that, because if we think ourselves that here's this victim and the reason that they got assaulted didn't really have anything to do with the perpetrator, it had something to do with the fact that they were doing something that exercised poor judgment or might have been a little risky. We don't blame a bank for getting robbed because it didn't have sufficient security. We don't blame a house for getting burgled if every other house in the neighborhood has a security system up and this one doesn't. We sort of recognize that it's really the perpetrator's moral responsibility for attacking someone, and so it ought to be okay to do something a little risky or a little dangerous without having to pay the price of being a crime victim. But nonetheless, we have a tendency to do that. Now, God forbid that a victim has a history of some delinquent behavior or criminal behavior. That also makes people question their judgment and question maybe whether they're telling the truth in this case. Also, if a victim has a history of mental health problems, this can contribute a lot to some of the things above. I mean, for example, if you have a severe mental health problem, you really can wind up with a situation where they're more vulnerable to being victimized. They may have more problems in terms of confusion and whatnot. They may self-medicate from time to time with alcohol in a way to try to cope with problems. And so this feeds on each other, and the more of these things that people have, the kind of worse it gets for them. Another thing that can create a problem is if a current crime victim has a history of prior victimization. So if they've only had one victimization, we're able to kind of say, well, okay, I can understand this could happen to them. But say a woman has been a domestic violence victim several times in the past, or a woman or a man has been abused sexually or physical abuse as a child, then we may begin to question, well, like, okay, why should we believe this victim? Because they've been a victim before, maybe they're making things up. Another thing that really contributes and makes a victim difficult is if they have some ambivalence about reporting or cooperating with the criminal justice system. I mean, I think what we think generally is if you're really a crime victim, then what you would do is you would just absolutely have no doubt about it, want to call the police, want to continue to prosecute the case, do everything you need to do. And so when somebody's not quite sure about what they want to do about this, I think we have some problems taking them seriously sometimes and knowing exactly what to do with them. Another thing that really creates a problem and makes victims difficult is if they have poor memory about some of the details of the crime. Many people think erroneously that memory is like a tape recorder, and so all you've got to do if something really happened to you is punch play, and there you have a blow-by-blow detailed description of everything that happened. But from modern neuroscience, as well as a lot of work with victims, we know that that's not the case.
What we'd like to do now is show you a brief video, and we'll let it roll.
And sometimes when you've been through a lot of stress, your video screen freezes up. I think we can go ahead and summarize. Basically, what you missed was a very compelling another minute, I think, that described the parts of the brain and what happens when the hippocampus gets overloaded and doesn't encode things in long-term memory. And the take-home point of all of this is that when someone is experiencing an extreme stressful experience like a crime, it's a life-threatening situation, there are actually brain changes that make things confusing. People can remember the key details of what happened, but often some of the peripheral details don't get encoded quite so much. And this can account for one reason why victims' stories are sometimes confused and maybe a little difficult to follow and maybe not 100% accurate, although the key details typically are. So let me move on to talk about why you should care about any of this. Probably should have done that first, but I guess you care about it or you wouldn't have been on the webinar anyway. But one of the reasons you should care about it is that it happens very frequently. These adverse childhood experiences and crime-related potential traumatic event experiences really happen very frequently among U.S. adolescents and adults. And so when you have someone who's been a child, been an adolescent, they're now an adult, the odds are pretty great that they will have had some of these experiences in their life. As we'll connect up a little bit later, these experiences often account for the reasons that victims behave in ways that make people question their credibility. And it also contributes to victim blame a lot of time because, you know, we think that we're not aware of this history that they have, so we don't understand how their current behavior is being affected by these past events. Knowing about these can really help us address some of the issues that happen often with difficult victims. Another thing that makes this very relevant to those of you who work with victims is that victims who have a lot of prior adverse childhood experiences and who have had crime-related potentially traumatic events are much more likely to have numerous other problems. So they often need more victim assistance to address crime-related stress and mental health problems. So again, if you know something about their history, it helps you in two ways. One, it helps you understand why they're behaving the way they're behaving. But two, it also gives you some clue about some of the current problems or the antecedents of the current problems that they have now based on past experiences that they've had.
Let me talk a little bit about the ACE study. It was a very classic study. It was done in mid-90s, 1994 to 95. For those researchers in here, you would be impressed with this. I know I am. It's been cited more than 9,000 times, so it's had a huge readership over the years. And it was conducted at Kaiser Permanente, which is a very, very large HMO in San Diego. And they basically were trying to, you know, the researchers were interested in what happens in childhood and how that impacts later health. The article was written and published in 1998 in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. I'm only going to hit the high points to it because obviously it was a very large study and with a lot of outcomes. But if you would like more details on that, you're not familiar with it, so it's the 1998 American Journal of Preventive Medicine, volume 14. So essentially, they measured and did the survey with adults. They had adults who had had a standardized medical exam, and then about a week after that, they would send them the questionnaire to fill out to look at experiences that they might have had, adverse childhood experiences prior to the age of 19. They mailed it out over the time they were gathering the data, collecting the data, to over 13,000 adults, and they got responses back from over 9,000. That's a 70% response rate, which is pretty good for studies, so I'm impressed with that also. And so it looked at the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. It looked at health-related problems. It looked at many things, and we'll sort of skip down to the next slide to look at that. And so essentially, you start out, what are adverse childhood experiences? So the groups who were doing this research said we want to look at certain areas. We want to look at a history of psychological/emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and then they also wanted to look at some factors that potentially had occurred in the household, and they labeled it household dysfunction, and they looked at substance abuse by a household member, mental illness or suicide by a household member, suicide attempt, intimate partner violence for either against a mother or stepmother, incarceration of household members, and parental separation and divorce. They didn't initially have the parental separation and divorce, but they did add it. So initially it had only 7 ACEs, but they moved it up to 8. So here, the next slide just gives us a very, very quick overview of kind of what they looked at. So if they looked at the risk factors that are known to sort of produce health problems, the ones that are listed on the slide are the ones that they came up with. So the bottom message or take-home message for this is, so the more types or categories of ACEs that they had, the more risk factors they had for health problems that we know are then typically related to health and disease conditions later. All of these that are listed there, the more prevalence and risk increased with the more number of cases of adverse childhood experiences they had suffered. And so the other part is I pulled out the top 4. So if you had those adults who are filling out this survey about their childhood experiences that had experienced 4 or more categories of ACEs, they had a 4 to 12 fold increase in these health risk behaviors. That's the depressed mood, suicide attempts, alcoholism, and drug abuse were the highest categories. So to sort of then cut to the chase on this, so if you had those health risk behaviors, what did it do to your health, connecting up things that happened as a child to diseases that you may have experienced later in life as adults? All the ones listed there came up, and they were the very strong, the ones with the asterisks with the strongest graded relationships with presence in adult diseases. So the take-home points for this slide, and let me explain the bottom one, the skeletal fractures. That stood for a proxy of unintentional injuries, implying that they had perhaps been experienced domestic violence or something like that, where they had a lot of skeletal fractures. So the take-home point for this slide is that there is a strong dose-response relationship between the breadth, meaning the numbers of ACEs that a person had experienced, and the multiple risk factors that led to several of the leading causes of death in our country. So the impact of an ACE upon adult health is strong and cumulative in nature. So that was the major study that came out. It's one of the landmark studies that's out there. You can sort of, like I said, find some other more details about that. There are some critiques of the ACE study. One of them, or a couple of them, has said, well, they studied adults, and so some subsequent studies were done a few years ago, and so in that study they said, well, because they studied adults, the study is retrospective in nature. The mean age of the person completing the survey in the ACE study was 56 years old. So the newer studies have looked at sort of a younger population, and they've measured youth and adolescents. But they also had a problem with the study that was done for the ACE at the Kaiser Permanente healthcare system, because it was one large healthcare system, but they were concerned that the results may not generalize well to other parts of that state, other parts of the country, places that were maybe less affluent than in that area. And so they raised issues of generalizability. The other parts that they had issues with were the component items were not formulated in any systematic process. So in the follow-up studies, they tried to expand that and do things a little differently. Other studies that have been done since then have added 10 additional items. 5 of those maltreatment. So what they did is they added to the abuse categories that were in the original ACE, but then they also added physical neglect and emotional neglect. And they also included the 5 items that looked at parental or family incapacities and or dysfunctions, what they called it in the original studies. But one of the other things they did is they had a whole new category, which was to include some things that are fairly common, unfortunately, nowadays, that may have very long-term effects on the well-being of the people who experience those, such as peer victimization, isolation or rejection from peers, high states of poverty that they grew up in, exposure to community violence, and all of these were also predictive of more distressed and mental health systems. So I guess to sort of come to a brief summary of this, ACE was an incredible study. Hat goes off to them because it was the original study that was done. It has been cited over and over again. But I also think that some of the newer studies have really tried to take what the findings that the ACE study came out with and sort of expand them more and to make them a little bit more updated with the amount of violence that happens, unfortunately, in schools and in homes these days. So they've added and tried to sort of in some way mediate the methodological problems that could have existed in the original ACE studies and to make it a little bit more recent and address those. So that's Finkelhor is one name of the studies that have been done since then. You might want to look them up if you're interested in that. But I think we're now moving towards expanding kind of our notion, I think, of what adverse childhood experiences really are nowadays.
Okay, and a change of pace now, what I want to spend a little time talking about is the DSM-5 post-traumatic stress disorder, crime-related potentially traumatic events. Try to say that 4 times quickly. I'm sorry, I apologize for my attempts at humor here because this is a very serious topic, but we have learned over our 90 years of experience in which Connie has had 60 and I've had only 30, that sometimes you have to have a sense of humor and maybe not take yourself so seriously because the work that we deal with we take incredibly seriously. So back to PTSD. One of the things about PTSD is that you have to have experienced a potentially traumatic event. Those events are, in summary, are things or events or experiences that occur anytime during your lifetime when you're a child, adolescent, or adult, or older adult for that matter. They have to involve death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, actual or threatened sexual violence. Also, they include PTEs, just for short, which is potentially traumatic events that are either directly experienced, it means it happens to you, you see it happen to someone else, or you learn that a loved one was killed or seriously injured. There's also a new category, which I'm not going to get into, but which is actually applicable to some of the work that some of you do, is that if you have vicarious exposure, meaning that you're seeing things, reading things about these kinds of events that happen, that can be a potentially traumatic event as well. Now, the type of potentially traumatic event that most of you are probably most familiar with is sort of military combat, war zone exposure, and all that. There's also natural disasters and motor vehicle accidents and other kinds of accidents. But actually, the point that I'm wanting to stress here is that a large number of potentially traumatic events are crimes, which include various kinds of child maltreatment, various types of sexual violence, aggravated assault, criminal domestic violence, the murder of a loved one or close friend, driving while intoxicated deaths, as well as terrorist attacks or hate crimes. So all of those things count as potentially traumatic events and that are capable of producing PTSD. What I want to do is to provide you with some information from a series of studies that we did that were called the National Survey of Adolescents, and actually we did a replication of that about 10 years later. This was actually funded by the National Institute of Justice, and I'm just going to give you enough methodology just to whet your appetite, but you can look this up and get even more details about the methodology if you wish to. Briefly described, there was a telephone survey of a nationally representative sample of slightly over 4,000 American adolescents between the ages of 12 and 17. We interviewed a parent first, got their permission to interview the child, and then randomly selected at least one adolescent per household, interviewed them. We got information about victimization history and several areas of mental health and other types of functioning. We then did a follow-up of that study, or follow-up of the people who were in that study, and did a second assessment wave, which was done 7 to 8 years afterwards with a subset of 753 participants in the first wave. At this point, they were young adults, 19 to 24. We assessed victimization history, and I'm talking about criminal victimization history occurring between wave 1 and 2, as well as mental health problems including PTSD, major depression, and substance abuse. This one was actually funded by the Centers for Disease Control. I would ask you to raise your hands if you want me to read this, but I'm assuming that I can't see you, and so therefore all of your hands being raised wouldn't inform me. But this just gives you some of the key variables that we measured in both waves of the study. All right, so in the first wave, and again, these are 12 to 17-year-olds. They're all over America. They're not a treatment-seeking sample. We found that male and female, so we found that almost 8% had been victims of a contact sexual assault. Over 1 in 5 had been a victim of a pretty severe physical assault or physically abusive punishment. 41% had witnessed a pretty serious form of violence, either at home, in their neighborhoods, or at school. And so if you totaled all that up, well, you don't total it up because basically it adds up to more than that, but about half of this sample of 12 to 17-year-olds had been a victim of one of these 3 types of violence, whereas about the other half had not been a victim of one of these 3 types of violence. When we looked at mental disorders, 3.8% had PTSD, 6.2% had current depression, 11% had substance use, or abuse rather, and about 12%, about 1 out of 8, had some type of past year delinquency of, some of which was more serious property crimes and some of which was actually violent crimes. Okay, this one is not working the way that we wanted it to, because this was gonna wow you with our technological prowess here. But let me just talk, because what was going to happen is we were going to push buttons, and then PTSD would come up, and then depression and whatever. But down at the bottom, it goes from, pardon me, it describes the number of types of violence they have experienced, which could range from none on the left to 3 types on the right. And what you will see is that for all of these disorders, for PTSD, for depression, for substance abuse, and for delinquency, there's kind of a dose-response relationship there, in that the more of these types of violence you've had, the more likely you are to have PTSD. Now, again, what this establishes is a strong relationship between the types of violence you've had already as an adolescent and the likelihood that you will have each of these kind of mental health problems as well as delinquency. And the group that had 3 different types of violence, again, these are very high rates of all of these disorders, given the fact that this is not a treatment-seeking sample, it's not a help-seeking sample, it's basically a sample of teenagers. All right, what happens between waves 1 and 2? I mean, remember, this is 7 to 8 years, and so they've gone from being teenagers to being young adults. Well, it turns out that about this is of women only. We got some sexual assaults of men, but it was much lower compared to the women. The 7.7% had been victims of a forcible rape. Another 7.2% had been victims of drug or alcohol facilitated rape. So overall, 12.5, which turns out to be 1 out of 8 of these young adults had been victim of a new rape between between wave 1 and wave 2 in that 7 to 8 year period. A pretty severe physical assault had been almost 16%. And then 1 out of 5 had suffered either a rape or a serious physical assault. So the key here is that these people, young adults in America, are at very high risk of these various very serious types of victimization. This does not include people who lost a family member or friend to homicide or a drunk driving crash. Doesn't include armed robbery, but just these 2 types of crimes. Doesn't include any witnessing of violence. So this is just direct victimization. In terms of the mental health problems, current PTSD was 7.4%, which is, by the way, kind of comparable to what you will see in combat veterans. Current depression, again, was almost 13%. Current substance use was almost 1 in 4. And alcohol is a much bigger problem than drugs, but the fact that 10% were taking illicit drugs is noteworthy. This last one shows what the risk of a new victimization, meaning a new physical or sexual assault, is depending on the number of different types of violence they had had previously when they were teenagers. And I believe that you can see that among people who had not had any physical or sexual assault or witness violence when they were teenagers, still 15.3% of them became victims of a new assault, physical or sexual assault. 21% of those who had had only one type before were victims of new assault. A third who had had 2 types when they were teenagers had had a new physical or sexual assault. And if you'd had all 3 types of violence, sexual assault, physical assault, and witness violence, almost half had been the victim of a new physical or sexual assault. So again, I believe this is probably one of the most important slides here because it indicates that what happens in childhood in terms of your violence history really affects the likelihood that you're going to become, a victim of a new assault. Now, that can be for a variety of reasons. One of the big reasons is a lot of times people do not get the help that they need when they're teenagers, sometimes because they don't report the crime, sometimes because they try to get help and they can't get help. And so they get off track, and this is one of the consequences of getting off track. So to briefly summarize those findings, the victimization, criminal victimization among adolescents and young adults is actually far from rare. In fact, it's the norm. And most of the people who've been victim of criminal sexual or physical assault or witness violence have had more than one type of violence during that period. The other thing is both PTSD, depression, substance abuse, and delinquency among this age group is substantial. And I didn't really present slides on this to keep you from going totally crazy. I omitted some detailed slides about comorbidity, but suffice it to say that many people who've had PTSD also have many of these other things. They also have depression. They also have substance use problems, largely because people self-medicate a lot of times to try to deal with some of these problems. The other thing that I just talked about before is exposure to the potentially traumatic events involving violence. The more of that you've had, the risk of your subsequent victimization goes up, as does the number of each of these disorders that I talked about before. So this is kind of a vicious cycle, and if these bad things happen early in life, they keep happening, which makes more victimization, which makes more likelihood of having mental disorders, delinquency, and illegal behavior. So it really is a vicious cycle, and understanding it can really kind of help us understand better the people, these difficult victims that we're seeing in our office. All right, this is kind of a shameless plug, but I wasn't always doing stand-up comedy. I actually also got invited one time to do a presentation at the National Academy of Sciences. So I couldn't help but put this picture here of me doing my talk at the National Academy. But what I want to do is to summarize really what we have learned from studies that we have done here at the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center with about 35,000, and that's a true number, crime victims, and also crime victims who are victims of mass violence. The first thing we've learned is that most victims do not develop mental health problems, but many victims do develop those problems. We've also learned that many victims recover, but many do not. Within a few months, 2 or 3 months after crime happens, there are a substantial number of people who do get better and are kind of not, they're changed, but they're not ever back to where they were before, but they no longer have clinically significant mental health problems. One of the huge things that we've learned in all kinds of studies is that social support is very protective, meaning if you have a good social support network, you do better. If you become a victim of crime, you're less likely to develop problems than those who have poor social support. We've also learned that having social support after something happens is incredibly important because that social support can assist you in recovering from something bad that's happened to you, including crime. We've also learned that most victims with mental health problems do not seek mental health treatment. Again, it's one of the banes of our existence that we know that we've got some things we could do to help people, but it's very, very difficult for them to come in for a variety of reasons, one of which is we remind them of the problem that they have that's leading them to come in. So we're the people who get associated with the crime that happened to them. So they're reluctant to come in. It doesn't mean that they don't want help or they don't need help. And finally, a history of criminal victimization increases risk of mental health problems that I've just talked about, but also some things like grief, including suicide attempts. Those are very related to these crime-related problems. Also, health concerns, health risk behaviors, and health problems. The same thing that Connie talked about in terms of the ACE experience. It's on steroids if you look at these kinds of events. It also does not help your school or your job performance. If you're having a lot of these symptoms and difficulties, it makes it very, very difficult for you to do well in school or on the job. And then also, when you become a victim of crime, you often have fear-related restrictions in your lifestyle and behavior. You pay a price, you no longer feel that you can go places and be safe. You no longer feel that you can be at home and be safe. There's nowhere you can be safe, and so that takes its toll too. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Connie.
You know, so I guess what we kind of want to end up on, we're getting near the end of these slides. We don't want to do death by PowerPoint for you. Sorry, we'll get better with this. When you think about the people that you work with, particularly for those of you who are in the victim services field and victim advocate field, you know, you know that the odds are that when you see many of the crime victims that you're working with, they probably have a prior history, very likely have a prior history that were discussed in the ACE study, in the crime-related PTEs study, in the crime-related mental health and substance abuse issues. And so as you learn and you've gotten better in your field, you know that these people are going to come in before you. And so one of the things is, if they've had these things happen to them earlier in life, they are probably then going to have some of the health risk behaviors that we talked about in the ACE study, and also that they are going to, for some of them, even develop health-related issues as adults related to their early childhood experiences. When you add some of the variables that they've included in some of the later studies that sort of followed along with the ACE study, and you throw in physical neglect and emotional neglect along with the things that can happen in their community, such as high crime rates in their community, poverty, exposure to community violence, peer victimization that we know happens more frequently today than it did in past years, it really expands the number of very crucial events that could happen to young children and to adolescents that then stick with them for life. And it has the double whammy of not only do they experience that, then people often look at them and blame them for whatever victimization they have experienced, and they don't believe them, and they find them difficult to work with, and all those negative connotations. But it's because of these huge prior histories of maltreatment and things within their home, and then things within their communities they live in, sort of prime them to develop these other later problems. So you'll see that more and more. And it also raises its head, like some of you, I do a lot of expert witness testimony for crime victims. And one of the things that is the most difficult on the stand is not the specifics of what happened during the assault, it is the victim's behavior, because panel members, if you're in the military court-martial system, or jury members within the civilian one, you can sometimes look and see they're just shaking their heads like they don't believe the victim because of their confusion, their disorganization, their poor memory for details, maybe the dangerous or risky behaviors they were doing, maybe the alcohol that they were drinking at the time, and it really goes against them. And so that's one of the things. The more we can talk about the relationship between those kinds of behaviors and see it through the lens of the ACE and so the crime-related PTEs and crime-related mental health and substance abuse problems, it makes their behavior not as, you know, in the difficult with the quotes around it. It's just how they are because they've had these terrible childhood experiences. So, you know, our mission is to sort of educate people just as your mission is in working with crime victims.
And there's some other things, too, that are related to reframing difficult victims and their behavior. One, the ACEs that weren't sort of crime-related reflect household chaos. I mean, that's one term for it. And also, if you're having all those difficulties in your household, you probably have a lack of supportive caregivers, not because they don't want to be, but they're just, they have so many problems themselves that they're incapable of actually giving the type of support and oversight, I guess, that all children want and need. And then if you also have childhood maltreatment and victimization, piled on top of that. That typically doesn't make a person think that they can trust other people and that people will believe you and not blame you if you report a crime. So this is sort of a double whammy because crime in general, a lot of these things, particularly if it's by someone in the household, your sense of basic trust is absolutely violated. You don't feel the world safe. You probably have experienced where people don't believe you and don't take what you're saying seriously. And so what that does is it really taints your whole ability to trust people, think justice will be done, think you will be believed if you bring things forward. So I ask you to put yourself in the position of someone who's been through these types of experiences. And then ask yourself the question, if I'd been through some of this, would I really feel comfortable talking to the criminal justice system? Would I really think that if I told people about this, they would believe me? Would I really think that people wouldn't blame me, particularly if I was engaged in some dangerous or risky behavior or had some sort of history? And I think you can understand it from that position that you'd probably have reluctance to report in that case, and you would have some difficulty in terms of cooperating. So put yourself in the shoes of someone who's had this experience, and I think it will help you understand your difficult victim better. The other point worth making is that perpetrators often have radar for individuals who they think are vulnerable. And in many cases, it's that they really know, they absolutely know that such individuals who are vulnerable because of a past history, because they're having some difficulty now, whatever, really are less able to protect themselves and recognize predators when they see them. And they're also probably less likely to report crimes due to concerns about being blamed and not being believed. So you've got these two things going on here, which is one, you're more vulnerable yourself, but two, the perpetrators are often picking you out from the crowd because they have a sense that you won't be able to protect yourself and that, you won't be as likely to report to law enforcement or anything because basically you'll be concerned that you've had this history, people will see you as a difficult victim, and therefore they will not believe you. So the bottom line of all of this is really that if you can see your way clear to reframe these difficult victims that you're seeing through this lens of how this past can affect what the present is now, that it can really help you understand them better. It can help you understand and explain some of their behavior that otherwise doesn't make sense. Excuse me. It also can help you understand the services that they might need, and it will help you learn how to support them better throughout the criminal justice system process. Excuse me again.
One of the things we wanted to add right before we close is that, as Dina said, not all victims of crime develop PTSD, and not all of them are in need of therapy. However, in your day-to-day course of your work, you may come in contact with crime victims where you're just thinking perhaps they could really use some specialized mental health services. And if that's the case, the good news is that there are very effective therapies for PTSD related to being the victim of a crime. And the evidence-based therapies that are very effective, number one is, not in the rank order, but is prolonged exposure. And so it is particularly effective in working for folks who have PTSD. Another one is cognitive processing therapy. It's not an exposure-based kind of treatment, but it's very effective, particularly when a person has a lot of negative self-blame statements going on and views of themselves for being a crime victim. Complicated grief therapy, we put that in there because some of the victims that you work with may have been victims mass violence incidents, or they may have lost, they are the surviving family member of somebody who was a crime victim, a homicide victim. And so the data is not quite as strong on that, but it is effective in alleviating a lot of the grief symptoms that they may have. And then the one on the bottom is the trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's TF-CBT, and that is for folks who are working with children. So the psychologists or mental health providers that are on this call probably are very aware of these kinds of therapies, but for those of you who are not, but you feel like someone you're working with is in need of them, these are the ones that are effective. So we wanted to end on that note that there is good news that there's something that can be helpful to these crime victims.
And we'd also like to thank you very much for participating in this, sticking with us. We've told you all we know, but we're sure we haven't told you all you need to know. So we're not quite sure how the question thing works, but if we can figure that out, we'd be happy to answer questions.
Hi, this is Susan. So I will just jump in here and invite people to enter your questions in the chat box. Please go ahead and mark it to all participants so that everyone can see your question and they'll know then if their question has already been asked. This is your opportunity to really dig into this topic. So we hope that there will be a lot of questions. Dean, I see the first question. Someone asks, is there a reason that EMDR is not included on your list of evidence-based treatment?
Yes. You want me to elaborate? EMDR, I think is an evidence-based treatment. It is kind of controversial in some, well, it's just flat controversial. Because it has a lot of people who vigorously support it. It has some other people who are skeptical. The skeptical people are skeptical only because, not because studies haven't been done that show that it can be effective. It is because the eye movement part, a lot of research indicates that that's not necessary. That bothers some people, it doesn't bother others. But I think being fair, we probably would put it on there. But in fairness, we also made a mistake about trauma-focused cognitive-based therapy. It's
behavioral therapy, should have been behavioral therapy.
Okay. I also see someone is asking about CBT. I guess that's cognitive-based therapy?
Behavioral therapy. Yeah, that's a broader base. CBT can be used for a lot of different things. It's kind of more of an umbrella term. It's not a specific therapy per se, but it is a broader based term. But it's certainly like TF-CBT is based on that, and so the principles of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, are found in both PE and CPT.
Great, thanks. We have another question. One of our participants says that they're not a social worker or clinical therapist, but what qualifies a person to offer and facilitate evidence-based therapies?
Well, typically you have to be a licensed mental health professional, or, I mean, you know, as an MD, you don't necessarily have to have a specialty in mental health. But typically, I guess the basic qualifications you have to have is that in most states you cannot practice mental health things without a license, and those are the license groups that you mentioned. The other is that just because you're licensed, that's sort of necessary but not sufficient when it comes to familiarity with evidence-based treatments for trauma-related problems. And that as mental health professionals, it has been our experience that when we go and talk to groups of victim advocates, and particularly groups of victims, that at halftime or in a break or after it's over, you will typically have several victims come up to you and tell you horror stories about how they've gotten bad treatment from mental health professionals who didn't know what they were doing. So there are some training tools available. I think what most people think is if you have not been trained in these treatments, there's some online courses. The trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, or TFCBT. There's an online course that's available for that. Most people think that it's also important to get some supervision on cases after you've completed a course in how to do it.
We have another question that I'm sure a lot of victim advocates have faced, and that is, if therapy isn't accessible in your area, or if the person you're working with is not open to therapy, how can a victim service provider best support that person?
And you bring up a good point. There are areas of the country where there are not many mental health providers, and many of them, may specialize in something else, schizophrenia, whatever, and not in trauma. So that is a real problem. There's been huge efforts in the last few years trying to get telemental health services set up for them, and that may be one way that there may, depending on the state or the community these people live in, they may have access or can find some resources that can be delivered via telemental health. And I will tell you the data on that is that telemental health is just as effective as in-person mental health. And that has been found in studies that have been conducted by the VA and the DoD, Department of Defense, who utilize it a lot, and it is very effective. There are issues. You have to have the right technology and those sorts of things, and the HIPAA compliance and all that. But they are very effective if somebody is interested in receiving trauma-focused kinds of therapy.
And I would just add to that a good victim service professional who basically believes the person communicates that they're trying to understand what they're going through and the history, how the history they've had might affect how they're doing now, and provides them with information, lets them know what's going on in the process, and all of those things. Even though that's not therapy, it still makes a huge difference to the victim, because the victim may not acknowledge that, and often don't. And one of the other things that makes victims difficult is that sometimes they're testy. Sometimes they can be hostile. They can lash out because they don't know anything else to do. But at some level, they know who's trying to help them and who isn't trying to help them. And though you may not be a mental health professional, and even some of these folks I'll tell you the secret, some of those folks who we've been talking about, they're hard for us to deal with as well. I mean, we both have a lot of training in that. But the fact that you communicate that you care about them and that you're trying to make things easier for them within that system to the limit of your abilities to do so, given the system and given your own training and skills, they still appreciate it, and it still makes a difference.
And one of the other things I would say is, maybe initially if you suggested maybe seeking mental health services to the person you're working with and they say no, you can always come back later and say, I've been thinking about it some more, and I really do feel like maybe this would be helpful to you. And would you like for me to help you find somebody in our community that provides, trauma-focused, trauma-informed therapy, and see if it's helpful. So sometimes just sort of bringing it up again. But I also echo what Dean's saying. Victims tell us oftentimes when they are in therapy, say, you know what, one of the reasons I'm doing so good is I had a great victim advocate, and so he or she was so helpful to me, and I feel like that's what even gave me the strength to come in and sort of, approach this in a more formal way in terms of therapy. So hats off to all you victim advocates out there. If you're tuning into this webinar, it probably shows that you're interested in sort of learning more and more about victims, and so that shows they know that.
Thank you. We had another question. What about the problem of people tolerating prolonged exposure but then being unable to finish a minimum number of sessions? Can that be risky to recommend PE?
Well, of course, what are your choices? I mean, if you don't start, you finish no sessions. And I would even argue that part of any treatment is that you are either explicitly describing what I would say your theory of the case is in terms of why these problems develop, what are the kinds of things that you can do to alleviate the problems. So there's a psychoeducational part of virtually any of these treatments. I mean, whether it's EMDR, whether it's prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, et cetera, or, you know, even a pharmacological therapy where somebody might be explaining that you have a problem at your synapse and this drug is designed to address that problem. So it does help people just to know, have some sense of why they're having these particular problems. Because a lot of times they don't understand it. It's coming out of the blue. They don't feel in control of things. And so in some cases it's not sufficient totally to do good, but it does help them to understand why, some of the reasons they might be having the problems. So it's better if you complete any treatment, but who's to say that some of the people who complete some treatment aren't benefiting? Because sometimes you learn what the rules are. And I mean, by that, I mean, you know, what you need to do in order to get better. And so sometimes you can practice that on your own. Dr. Patricia Resick, who developed cognitive processing therapy, did something like a 5-year follow-up, including people who dropped out of treatment. And the notion was you drop out of treatment, you're going to be doing worse. But then when they analyzed the data, they found that there were a substantial number of people who dropped out of treatment who actually were doing very well. And when asked, well, why'd you drop out of treatment? They said, well, I learned the principles and I didn't feel like I needed to come to treatment. So again, getting people to go to treatment, they absolutely will not benefit if they don't go to treatment. And they may benefit a lot, but there really is not a lot of data that suggests that people are harmed permanently by evidence-based treatments.
We had another comment. Someone said they're wondering if a trauma-related somatic regulation class or stress reduction classes could be developed and shipped out to the field that could be conducted by non-mental health professionals that might include referral to licensed mental health professionals. What would you think about that idea, or if trauma-related somatic regulation classes or stress reduction classes were developed that victim advocates could implement?
Well, I know what stress reduction classes is or are. I'm not sure what the first one is, but I will say generally, I mean, stress reduction, I mean, there are good principles there. They can be implemented by victim advocates if they're well trained and know what they're doing. I would also say that it's really important. Another important thing that was said in that comment was that people really should pair with mental health professionals, because sometimes you get in trouble when you get in over your head and then you don't know what to do. It's great if you have a good working relationship with with mental health professionals, so that if something goes wrong or it becomes clear that they need more than you have to offer, that you have some place to go with that, and those referral sources are facilitated, so you don't have to try to find somebody when it's the most difficult and time sensitive.
I was going to say, we believe in stress reduction kinds of things too. So, you know, if somebody says, gee, my person won't go to that, but they seem to be very uptight, you know, yoga, that's great. Send them there if that helps them. You know, anything that helps them sort of reduce their level of stress and overall is a good thing. There are a lot of self-help apps now that are out there for people that they can use. And so some of us are technologically challenged, other people are very good at that, but you know, anything you want to encourage your the person you're working with to reduce their stress is not going to be a harmful thing to them.
I would also add that practicing stress management techniques is not a bad thing for trauma researchers or for victim service professionals.
Yeah, the one thing we did not cover today, but I hope everybody realizes, is there's a lot of self-care that needs to be going on by the providers and the victim advocates, and even researchers are working with that. We work in a field that all day long you work with people who are highly stressed. They've been through these horrible, horrendous experiences, and so we also sometimes think that we're impervious to, you know, being affected by that, but that's not true. We are affected by that. If you aren't affected by it, shame on you. You should get out of this business. When you hear people that have been through these horrific things, you do kind of take it in. So if we want to kind of, you know, talk about that just real briefly, is that, I mean, to end with this maybe, is that that please take care of yourself in the field, and just you owe it to yourself to do that, and then you're better able to serve the next victim that walks in your door.
Or as they say when you're getting on the airline to fly someplace, in case of, in the unlikely event that there should be some issue, put your oxygen mask on first before you put it on the kids. So if you don't take care of yourselves, your ability to take care of those people you're trying to serve is pretty remote.
Well, thank you both for noting that. We will be having another session that should be open anytime after this session on vicarious trauma. So I encourage anyone who's interested in that topic to look at that recorded session. And also we had someone, when you were talking about apps and technology that can help with self-care, someone mentioned the DoD Safe Helpline app, which can be a good app for victims of sexual assault that the military uses.
The DoD puts out an outstanding number of good resources, so you can get on those. It's not always the most user-friendly for some computers, but you really can, and so the DoD puts out good stuff. So does the VA.
Yeah, I would encourage anybody to look at the National Center for PTSD at the VA. They've got some amazing resources that are available. I would also say that we're developing some apps and have developed some, particularly for people who've suffered the loss of a family member in a mass violence incident. And that, I mean, again, I think self-education, psychological education, and self-help procedures are incredibly valuable. And even though we're mental health professionals and are afraid that we may get drummed out of the profession if we say there's things people can do to help themselves without us, it's true nonetheless.
We had a question come in. Someone wonders whether the source of the abuse affects the outcomes as well. So, for example, is there any evidence of a relationship between the early childhood exposure, let's say that abuse comes from parents or caregivers, having a higher impact on mental health than other forms of negative experiences?
Well, it turns out that most people who are physically or sexually abused as a child, it's somebody they know well, sometimes a family member, sometimes a trusted friend, or any number of other type of relative. And really, I think the evidence is probably not as good as it should be, but I don't think there's a lot of evidence that it matters that much. Even though a lot of studies have not looked at trust per se, but if a stranger does something to you, it may make it difficult to know who to trust, because particularly if you don't know them, it may be that you will have more trust issues, and some have said betrayal issues if it's somebody who ought to be taking care of you, ought to be not taking advantage of you, does something. But again, whomever does it, a lot of these things are very, very bad, and they have very negative consequences. And so if you're in a situation that you view to be life-threatening, it just changes you, and it doesn't matter as much who put you in that situation.
That's great. Folks, we have a few more minutes if there are any additional questions out there. It's nice to see that there have been some other suggestions of apps that are out there, and I hope that this portion of the discussion continues throughout this week so that we can share resources that each of us has found helpful with one another. All right, I am not seeing any additional questions come in. Dean and Connie, I want to thank you so much for your time today. This has been really enlightening, thinking about the way that adverse childhood experiences and other negative experiences, particularly crime and abuse that affects children, can lead to further victimization, as well as complications in the way that those victims are viewed that can thwart their ability to get the response that they need to recover. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was our pleasure, and we wish you great success with the rest of your series.
Bye.
All right, goodbye, everyone, and I hope you'll check into the discussion board and continue this discussion throughout the week. Goodbye.